Welcome back to Media's Performance Podcast. This is the first episode of 2021. We're in the future. This episode was recorded though in November 2020 at the hopefully was the end of the COVID palaver, and we're releasing this in 2021. Hopefully we're all still alive and 2021 isn't worse than 2020. The reason I held back this episode was because we really wanted to focus on strength and conditioning in this talk, and I knew that many people would be looking at potentially, getting fit, starting new goals, getting out there, hitting the gym, hitting the road, jumping in the ocean, the pool, whatever it might be, after the Christmas and New Year's celebrations, whether they be crazy or pretty quiet, depending on where you are and what restrictions you have. That being said though, I think it's always a time of year that people do look to make some changes. So it's very fortunate to have Arthur Lynch on today, who's recently completed his Ph.D, and we talk all things strength and conditioning. Arthur gives a bit of his background as well around his Ph.D, sort of at the end of the podcast actually, instead of at the start where we normally provide credibility. But please hang on to the end and Arthur will run through some of his research. The first part of the podcast is very much focused on the kind of trade-offs with strength and conditioning, what works, the nuanced things that we must take into account depending on age, injuries and so on. Lots of things in here for everybody, so very much a kind of a personal podcast for you at the start of the year if you're looking to make some changes and incorporate some strength and conditioning in, or you're just looking to broaden your knowledge base in this area. Arthur's a very nice guy, very engaging, lots of good information here, so I hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, we're at meliusconsulting.com.au. You can find us there, or on Instagram at Sleep for Perform, or at Melius Perform, and on Twitter now as well at Melius Perform, and we're on Facebook as well, LinkedIn, the whole lot. So you just search Melius and you should be able to find us. Anyway, on with the episode. This going. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to Media's Performance Podcast. Today I am joined by the Prince of Limerick. We had the King of Limerick on before, Kieran O'Regan. So Arthur, by definition, being the second after Kieran, I'm going to call you the Prince. How's that? Would that be a good nickname?
That's an honour. Thank you.
It's an honour, is it?
Yeah.
So Arthur is joining us today from down the river from my old hometown in Ireland, a town called Athlone, which no listener will probably know where that is. Everybody always goes to me, "Oh, whereabouts in Ireland are you from?" I go, "Athlone." They go, "Where's that?" I go, "Right in the middle." And they go, "Outside Dublin?" No. Where Dublin is, where Galway is, halfway between. On the River Shannon? No, I don't know it. And I go, "I know you wouldn't know." But anyway, the River Shannon flows down to the sea, and at the end of that great river, at the estuary, is a city called Limerick that used to be called... Do you remember what it used to be called, Arthur? You're a bit younger than me, so you maybe don't remember what it used to be called.
No, enlighten me.
Stab City.
Oh. Oh, it's still called that, I'm afraid.
It's still called that. All right, we're moving swiftly along. Go and listen to my episode, everybody, with Kieran O'Regan if you want to hear the story on the background of Stab City and some of Kieran's tales. So Arthur, thanks for coming along this morning. Morning in Ireland, here in the afternoon in Australia. So obviously we have some Irish guests on the podcast, and it's by pure chance and by pure crossover in our respective fields. We weren't sort of mates or knew each other in Ireland, so it's kind of weird. I end up speaking to lots of Irish people living here, however. Arthur, can you give the listeners a quick intro of who you are, where you're from, and what your kind of high-level background is before we delve into it?
Yeah, sure. No problem at all. So I suppose where to start. I would consider myself a bit of a sports science generalist, if you like. So my own background is in sport and exercise sciences. Education wise, I did my BSc in sport and exercise sciences at the University of Limerick. Then a few years later, I came back and went into my PhD, which I've just recently completed. We'll say that was in sports science as well, because there's a bit of a story around how that progressed from. Originally was meant to be based on exercise physiology, and by the end of it, it was more biomechanics, if anything. Then personally, my own interests have always centered around lifting weights. The specific area has sort of jumped around a little bit over the years. So originally it was, I actually got into lifting weights for playing rugby initially. And then throughout my leaving cert year, or wherever you are in the world, maybe last year of high school, if you like, even though I was up to that point, rugby was everything. Over the course of that final year, I started to fall out of love with rugby, and started to fall in love with lifting weights more and more and more, and just got interested in the adaptations to lifting weights, and then got interested in nutrition and all these other different things. So that's actually what led me down the route of sports science. But that, a couple of years down the line, moved into bodybuilding, did a couple of shows, quickly burnt out and got fed up with that. Then I just went back to being a guy who just lifted weights like I was before. And then I ventured into powerlifting. Got really into that. I'm still involved in powerlifting, though I haven't competed in quite a while, although I'll go easy on myself because with the pandemic hitting, all the competitions were cancelled anyway. Though that said, I hadn't any aspirations of competing this year. And so now I'm somewhere between a full-time powerlifter and a guy who just lifts weights. Yeah, just lifts weights again.
So Arthur, that's really interesting, because lots of people do get into lifting weights playing rugby. You know, I grew up playing rugby, which I've spoken about before, and you know, I sort of got into lifting weights as well. But unfortunately, as I got older, I got skinnier and started shrinking. But when we talk about bodybuilding, lifting weights, and powerlifting, how would you describe and how would you distinguish the three of those different terms? Because they're kind of used interchangeably a lot of times, but they are quite different.
They are, yeah. And I was actually asked something similar to this on another podcast a few months back about, like, you'll hear like resistance training versus strength training versus lifting weights, and are they different? And short answer, no, and then more nuanced answer, they're slightly different, yeah. But basically, yeah. So I mean, like, lifting weights is basically what it says on the tin, just lifting weights for the sake of it, and that might be for general performance, with general performance goals in mind, general health goals in mind. Then bodybuilding is lifting weights as a means to an end of building your body, and also, you know, through a combination of diet and other exercise modalities, namely cardiovascular exercise, you look to reduce your body fat levels whilst maintaining your muscle mass through diet and your weight training.
Yeah.
To ultimately lead to, you know, well, Arnold Schwarzenegger would describe it as muscularity, this sort of halfway house between lots of muscle and very low levels of body fat. Yeah. Then powerlifting is a sport whereby, of course, obviously you're going to be lifting weights as well. But in contrast with bodybuilding, the performance isn't based on your physique. It's based on how much weight you can lift in the three events: the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift. So when I say I go through periods where I just turn back into being a generalist, basically what I mean by that is I spend less time focusing specifically on the squat, bench, and deadlift, and I might focus on other lifts, or I might change the routine so that the repetitions are a bit higher, and there's just generally more variation in the training.
You know? Yeah. So powerlifting isn't per se about any sort of, you know, body sculpting, body image, low body fat. It's not aesthetically, it's not an aesthetic sport, so to speak. It's more about, how much heavy shit can you lift, really, regardless of what you look like.
Yeah, essentially. Now you can get a lot of that as a byproduct, but it's not the
Yeah,
main outcome. So I mean, you'll see
that's
some,
yeah,
particularly nowadays, as the sport has particularly grown in the last sort of 6 or 7 years. You'll see some absolute freaks that are really, really strong and have incredible physiques as well. Um, but yeah, as you say, it's not judged based on who's the most muscular or leanest athlete. Um,
yeah. So, Arthur, what do you find? What's the kind of the reward for you by lifting weights? And what I'm thinking about is a lot of people kind of throw a lot of muck or dirt at something like CrossFit and go, "Oh, these people are just like really good at exercising." And then other people might say, "Well, look, I don't really like just lifting weights because it's kind of boring, it's repetitious, and same old thing, and I'm not really doing it for a specific goal." So what's the with and what's in it for you? What's the meaning for you by how do you kind of stay focused by lifting weights and
yeah.
powerlifting?
Well, just firstly on that first point about CrossFit, because that's something that frustrates me too. People will kind of scoff at CrossFit because, and this is the thing you see amongst the different lifting cultures. So whether it's Olympic lifting, scoffing at uh, um, powerlifters, or bodybuilders taking issue with powerlifters, or powerlifters taking issues with bodybuilders for various different reasons. If you dig deep enough, you'll find a plethora of different issues with all the different muscle
Yeah,
sports, if you like. Um, so yeah, it just kind of frustrates me. I mean, I just look at CrossFit as a sport. Now, I suppose a lot of the critique would be around some of the crazy stuff they do, but I mean, there's plenty of that. If you go looking for it, there's plenty of that in powerlifting. There's plenty of that in weightlifting, and there's definitely plenty of that in bodybuilding as well. And there's
yeah,
lots of issues. People that are calling themselves coaches that probably shouldn't be. That there's big issues with performance enhancing drugs and all this kind of stuff that maybe we might get into later on. But to not sidestep your question completely, what it does for me, honestly, and this is a very underwhelming answer, I just enjoy it.
yeah,
It's just an activity that I enjoy. Now, a lot of that is because of the adaptations that I derive from it. So, increased strength, muscle hypertrophy, generally improved body composition. But the actual just going to the gym, lifting weights, in and of itself, it's just an activity that I enjoy doing. You know.
yeah. You just like it, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think in some ways, like one of the things is, and I've dabbled like in CrossFit, weightlifting, kettlebells, all different sort of modalities,
Mm,
to complement running, swimming, and jiu-jitsu. But I think one of the things that I like about when I did lift, sort of do the classic kind of strength training that Mark Ripperton, those guys advocate, is that it's quantitative. You can
yeah.
apply a number to it. You're not competing with anybody else. You're competing with you in the bar, and a bit like what Henry Rollins says, about the iron doesn't lie type of thing, and it's kind of,
Mm,
but you can see the progression there as well. Um, a lot of people, talk about different types of strength training and different types of strength and conditioning training. I think strength and conditioning training really, a lot of people don't talk about the conditioning, they just talk about the strength training. And then people a bit like diets as well. Maybe not as bad as diets, but a lot of people get kind of evangelical about what works and what doesn't work. And people go, right, well, if you're a jiu-jitsu guy, the best thing you can do is do powerlifting. If you're a long distance runner, CrossFit's the best thing for you. And, and I've had this conversation with some people, and some people, like, I remember, like, I was doing long distance running, and I was running, I don't know, maybe 80 to 100 Ks a week, lots of elevation change, running with a backpack. One guy said to me, "You should be doing CrossFit 5 times a week on top of that." I was like, "There's no fucking way I'm doing 5 sessions of CrossFit. At the max, I'm doing 2 strength and conditioning sessions, you know, whether it's CrossFit or whatever it is, but at the max, I'm doing that." But people have this idea that you have to do 5 strength training sessions a week, 5 of your chosen sport, and then it's a bit like when people listen to Rogan, and they go, you do like this many hot yoga sessions, this many jiu-jitsu, this many kickboxing. It's like, how do you have a full-time job? Like, how do you work? How do you make money? Because you're spending like 30 hours doing this, and it just becomes crazy. So how I know this is a hard question to answer, but what guidance would you give people on basically figuring out what strength and conditioning training would work for their sport, whether it be endurance, whether it be martial arts, whether it be, a team-based activity like rugby or soccer? What sort of questions do you think people should ask themselves before they choose this particular type of strength and conditioning? And I know that's a hard question.
Yeah, it is. In all those different examples you've given, the context around it could be completely different. So, I mean, you could have your recreational runner who does all his own training plans and all that kind of thing versus, a rugby player who's part of a team and maybe they have an assigned strength and conditioning coach. So he follows what they do. But generally, let's say you're in the former camp. Let's say you're doing your own training plans for running or martial arts or whatever it is. I mean, presumably, if you're going from absolutely nothing, the biggest benefits will come from going from nothing to something. And that's something, as you say, like if you go from 0 to 5 days a week kind of thing, that's more than likely not going to end well, no matter what it is. So let's start, like this concept of the minimum effective dose. Let's try and attain that. So for someone who's been doing nothing at all, that could be once a week. If they could get in twice a week, I'd say that's probably better. But at that point, I wouldn't be stretching beyond that because, like you said as well, you have to fit it in on top of all your other training. And at some point, you can't just keep adding and adding. That, like, your body's going to bite back at you eventually if you keep doing that. Just like if you were to add extra running sessions, eventually you'll start running into, pun unintended there, issues with overuse injuries and those kind of things, and just leaving yourself more susceptible because it's adding additional training volume that may exceed your capacity to recover, and that's usually what culminates in injury or underperformance. Yes, for someone who's been doing absolutely nothing, start with 1 to 2 days per week. Look for someone who knows what they're doing as well. Look for a reputable coach. Like if you go at it by yourself, the likelihood is you're going to make a lot of mistakes, and that's okay because you can learn from that. But you can circumvent that or a lot of that if you hire a coach. Even if it's just to get you started, and if it's just to show you how to perform some basic exercises with correct technique and teach you about progressive overload and appropriate volumes and how to progress the training over time. Teach you about things like deloads and manipulating the training stimulus in such a way that's facilitative of performance rather than just adding extra fatigue onto what you're already doing. Now I'm speaking very kind of broadly and overview level there because without knowing the specifics of the individual, it's difficult to give a specific answer.
No, I think, and I said that as well. It's a difficult question. I do like to ask that question sometimes just to see how people approach it, because I find it really interesting. Like I said, people get evangelical about different types of training modalities. I remember a number of years ago, myself and Reed Reel, who's been on Danny Lennon's podcast, Sigma Nutrition, who you may know he works at the UFC now, and he was on this podcast a few episodes ago. And myself, Reed, another guy called Israel Halpern, who you may know, he's been on Danny's podcast as well. Want to get Israel on actually, because Israel's got a kind of a very unique mindset as well around coaching fighters and so on. He's very, he kind of crosses that boundary with psychology and sports and a bit of philosophy as well. But I remember somebody asked Israel this question at the AIS in a presentation. What's the best training program for someone doing MMA? And Israel went like, what kind of fighter do they want to be? No one was actually thinking about the goal in mind of like the athlete. It was like driving it the opposite way around about what the training is, not about what's the sport? Okay, they want to be a fighter. What kind of fighter do they want to be? Do they want to be like a grappler who drags people to the mat like a Khabib? Do they want to be a stand and bang guy like Nate Diaz and, wear people out, more of an endurance type fighter? Or do they want to be like a Paulo Costa who's like muscled up and just comes in? So it's really interesting again. And it kind of aligns with what you're saying, Arthur, but it depends on the person, even within the sport, and what type of player or what type of athlete they want to be. What I found really interesting that Israel said was, it depends on what they like doing. He goes, because I might push powerlifting over and over again to somebody as a heavyweight fighter, saying that they need to increase strength, but they may absolutely detest doing that, and they might love lifting kettlebells, and they might love doing kettlebells, pushing a sled, climbing a rope, more kind of HIIT training. So, if they're not going to do that or do it badly, I'm going to pick something that they like doing.
Right, exactly. And I think that kind of hits the nail on the head of sort of just don't be dogmatic with things. Now, for example, let's just say, for instance, if someone wanted to learn Olympic lifting and they thought that was going to be the thing that was going to unlock their athletic potential, if they came to me, I would be probably referring them, because that's not what I specialize in. I couldn't really teach you how to do a snatch. I could bluff my way through it, but I'd be doing you a disservice. So I'd outsource things. But just don't be dogmatic about it. So for instance, like, I could write you the most perfect training program that on paper would improve your performance. But if you're only going to, maybe you're going to perform it sort of half-arsed, you're not that pushed about it, you're skipping sessions, this kind of thing. Compared to, like, if I wrote a suboptimal training program on paper, but you really enjoy it, you train really hard when you do it, and you adhere to it really well, that's more than likely going to produce a much better result.
Yeah. So with that then, Arthur, like, when we talk about strength and conditioning training, should we, look at, having predominantly more, and this is kind of leading off the back of this, more kind of high intensity interval training sessions, or should we just lift weight for strength and for pure strength, or should we mix and match those throughout the week?
It probably depends on what adaptation you're looking for. So, like those examples you gave, like HIIT training or circuit style training versus pure strength training, I classify, let's operationally define strength as, we're working on maximal strength. So we're talking low repetitions, high load, so high percentage of your 1RM, longer rest periods, that kind of thing. It depends on which adaptation you've determined is going to give you the greatest benefit for your performance. And the answer to that may be dependent on where you are in your training career. So, for example, if you're a novice athlete and you don't have a lot of weight training experience, you're probably better off focusing more of your time on maximal strength. And then once that's of a sufficient level, once you are, in inverted commas, strong enough, then you might move towards more explosive strength adaptations, because you're already strong enough that now maximal strength isn't going to limit you. If you're in a strength sport, you can't be too strong. But in most other sports, you get to a point where you're strong enough, and by just pursuing maximal strength further, at that point, you're chasing sort of a point of diminishing returns, So at that point, you might move towards more explosive strength work. Or, for example, if you identified that your conditioning was limiting you, then you might incorporate more circuit style training sessions, or HIIT training, as you pointed out as well. So it really just depends on what adaptation you're looking for. Again, same thing with like hypertrophy. Maybe you need a bigger engine, so you spend a little bit of time focusing on pure hypertrophy, and you accompany that with a calorie surplus and sufficient protein. So the nutrition has to come into it as well.
Yeah, and then I suppose, Arthur, on top of that, we have the added sort of variable of age ranges. So, like, when I was younger, like, for example, you spoke about when you were playing rugby and lifting weights, I was in a similar kind of boat. when I was young, I think a lot of young men want to be big and strong and, whatever. And then you kind of have some injuries and things go on, and then you hit your 40s, and now I'm just more about kind of, movement. I've kind of gone away from the heavy weights. I've gone more towards still lifting some weights like once a week, but doing more kind of endurance activities because I like them, like long distance swimming, long distance running, still doing martial arts. But my sort of HIIT sessions will say I do more HIIT style workouts because I enjoy them. I get a bit of all around condition. I mix in body weight, kettlebells, skipping, some bar work, mix them all in together. Because I know, number one, like what you're saying, I'll do it, and number two, I enjoy it, and I get it done really quickly as well, and it gets me it forces me to move in different ways I wouldn't normally, and obviously, like I spoke about on this podcast before, I've had some spinal injuries and just had spinal surgery this year, so loading up my upper back and neck with 120 kilos of weight is probably not the best thing I could do. So there's all those added kind of things of, as you get older, you want to be more focused on mobility and movement and all these injuries. So I think that's another variation that people should consider, because, a lot of people are listening to this now in the new year. They've come out of Christmas on the back of COVID as well. And people are probably going, 2021, I'm going to blast this. I'm going to, train like a demon. I'm going to change my diet. I'm going to try and change 100 things at once. So I think I think whilst we're not giving people, the answers, we're giving them some general questions and frameworks that they need to ask and ascertain where they need to go and where they need to be.
Yeah, and in those examples, like you really are setting yourself up for failure with just these like lofty aspirations of, I'm going to take up 101 different things and go hell for leather on all of them. Like pick one, and a fairly modest objective. It's not particularly exciting, but if you could adhere to it and make it stick, you're going to be far better off. And then maybe you can build on that in time. So, for example, I mentioned about maybe you start with 2 training sessions a week. Excuse me. Once that becomes habitual for you, maybe you can bump that up to 3, possibly even 4. But the main thing is to get the initial sort of behavior change, and then just make that a habit for you, and then you can build on that in time. One thing you noted as well about like older versus younger individuals, there's a few things to.
Sorry, I'll use a more technical term for Irish people: old lads versus young lads.
Absolutely, to use the scientific terminology. But there's a few things to kind of to note there. Is that, like, well, firstly, everyone has the ability to adapt. You see this even with research in older adults, whereby they might be 60, 70, 80 plus, and they can still adapt to weight training. But it just means that their start point might be that bit lower. And you just need to be a bit more careful with how you progress things, because the rate at which they can adapt isn't the same as someone who's 19, 20. The other thing as well is, so in your example specifically, you have a lot more considerations there. So previous injury history being one. So we wouldn't be loading you up for a 1RM back squat the first day you come in. We might be starting you off with like a dumbbell goblet squat or some split squats.
Exactly what I do now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's perfectly reasonable. You might progress towards some light back squats in time, but it needs to be gradual and done at a rate that your body can adjust to and adapt to. So the principles are going to be the same for the younger and the older individual. It's just that the rate at which you can do things and how aggressive you can be with the progression is going to differ. And that can be, you can have a young person who's messed up with injuries as well. The same approach, So yeah,
I think it's really interesting, Archie, to speak about the adaptation with the older people, just to throw in an old war story. So back about 18, 19 years ago, when I left the military, I was working as a personal trainer, physical trainer, whatever you want to call it, in a recreational sports centre in Ireland, in my hometown. One of those classic kind of government bodies that has like a pool, a gym, and coffee shop and whatever. So we started up a a seniors gym, we call it, for over 55s, which really was actually quite young now when I think about it, As I get older, I go, actually, it was quite young. But we call it seniors gym. And it was just basically anybody for over the age of 55. And we sort of had a session for them in the gym. And we just kept it to machine weights. We brought them around and give them, machine weights and cardio machines. And we brought around and give them a kind of an induction of a circuit we would do with these things every week. And we, would put a timer on that would go around, change, whatever we talked to them in between. It was absolutely amazing to see. We had people from the age of 55 right through to the mid-80s, and it was absolutely amazing to see, one, their increase in what they could lift on machine weights, two, their posture and their mobility change over 10 or 12 weeks, how they came into the gym and how they left. Three, the relationships start forming between people. So from a mental health perspective, and the kind of flirting that went on as well with men and women. And then finally the confidence that people had. This guy came in, I used to call him Surfer Dude because he used to come in wearing this Hawaiian shirt with short sleeves, and he used to walk on the treadmill. But the incline was getting higher and higher and higher every week, and he was looking around, and some of the women, and these guys were in their late 70s, some of the women were eyeing him off. And I thought, this is unbelievable. They're kind of behaving, and I was only 23, 24 at the time. And it was kind of, for me, it was I can't believe these people behave like that. But it was absolutely amazing to see that through lifting some weights, low to moderate for their age and size, to see all these additional benefits that came over, and you just remind me of that story about the benefit of older people, lifting weights, because we weren't running a controlled study, but we all commented on that. And actually, that's where I met my wife. She was working there as an Australian. Yeah, that's where we met. And so, she's often said that to me if we're sitting here watching TV here in Australia. And I remember we used to do that seniors gym, and I go, yeah, Surfer Dude. She'd start laughing, and we kind of laugh about it smile about it in a kind of a very nice way about the whole change in it. So I think there's other benefits too through those type of activities that are really, really good. Like you said, you just like going to the gym, so it can be good as well in that respect.
Yeah, and one point that you bring up there as well is about machine weights, because many people are inclined to want to knock machine-based resistance, and some of the reasons are kind of fair enough. For example, if you wanted to kit out a gym, it's going to be an awful lot more expensive to kit out a gym with a machine for every main movement, if you like, versus just bars, racks, and dumbbells. If that makes sense. However, machines in the right context are very effective. There's one study that your man Brad Schoenfeld loves to refer to as a those that would knock machine weights for not being functional. And this study, I think, is from the early 90s, where they had very elderly subjects. I think some of them were in their 90s. And the protocol was leg extension machine resistance. And at the very end of it, some of the subjects were able to throw their canes away. That's how effective it was. Yeah. It's wild. Yeah. So it's anyone who says that machines aren't functional or, that are useless, they just point them in the direction of that study. It's wild. It's all about context, Ian,
Yeah, for sure. And this is a great conversation, because we're coming up with more questions and more variations and more issues that need to be kind of considered when people are, approaching them. One more thing I do want to ask you on this topic, Arthur, because I do want to come back to I don't want to come back to your PhD. We should have started with your PhD, but we'll get your credibility at the end of the podcast. How about that? We'll do it the opposite way around. We just went down the rabbit hole. One thing I do want to ask you about, what about bodyweight exercises? You see, a lot of people starting to do bodyweight exercises during the COVID lockdowns, reduce space. I've always been a proponent of them traveling. And one of the greatest kind of travel workouts that I used to do when I was traveling for business and be in a hotel room, and I just couldn't be kind of asked going to the gym or, getting clothes dirty if I was on a layover. I would strip down to my underpants. I know that's a horrible sight, so please imagine that tonight, everybody. And I would do a workout in the hotel room that would just require basically your own body, which was set a clock for 7 minutes, do as many air squats as you could in 7 minutes, rest for 3 minutes, and then do as many burpees as you could for 7 minutes. That's 14 minutes of work. I tell you one thing, Arthur, that workout used to fuck me up. absolutely destroy me, and I needed no weights, no nothing. And I tell you, I've done it before in clothes, and halfway through you take off your clothes because you get that hot. It's absolutely exhausting. So when people say they need lots of equipment, they can't afford a gym membership, I say, have you got 14 minutes a day? Yeah, go do this workout. I remember one lady who I ran into, and I told her that about doing that workout. Oh, that's easy, I'll do that. 2 days later, what the fuck? She said that I couldn't do that. I couldn't even do 7 minutes of air squats. I went, yeah, kill you. I said, imagine doing that, like, like twice, 3 times a week for a month. How good you get? No, nearly killed me. There's no way. That's crazy. She said 14 minutes. So what's your thoughts on bodyweight exercises, and how could we potentially incorporate them in? Not doing a crazy, stupid workout like I was doing there, but what's your thoughts on that?
Right, yeah, because depending on what way you go about it, you can properly mess yourself up with that kind of stuff. But
Yeah. I burn in my chest. I go smoking cigarettes at the end of
yeah. Well, I suppose if we think of it this way, let's come back to our adaptations that we were talking about earlier on that we can derive from actual weight training. So let's think of like increased strength, increased hypertrophy, power, those kind of things. Where would body weight training lie, on a spectrum of effectiveness for those kind of adaptations? For max strength, you'd probably say not great. For hypertrophy, it can be very good, particularly in the upper body. I mean, if you think of like push-ups, pull-ups, inverted rows, if you can do them, handstand push-ups, and then things like you're in your hotel room there. You can do some lying skull crushers to work your triceps a little bit harder and things like that. You can get inventive. With the lower body, it's a little bit trickier because you can do your air squats, and they're very good for maybe a conditioning session, or just doing, in inverted commas, a workout. Just to get some general exercise in. Not to say that they're not difficult or anything, but for hypertrophy and strength outcomes, the load probably wouldn't be high enough. For power, it's easy. You just do the same movements and try and do them faster. Just working on the speed. So, explosive push-ups, explosive lunges or squats or things like that. But yeah, with strength and hypertrophy, for the lower body, you have things like air squats. Depending on your level, they might be reasonably challenging for you. Body weight lunges or split squats, that gets a little bit more difficult then, because you have the same body weight distributed. It's not entirely on the front leg. I mean, I think there was one study that used the rear foot elevated split squat, and they tried to look at what's the distribution of the forces front leg to rear leg. So if you picture, like, you have you're in a lunge position, so one leg's in front of the other, but the rear leg is up on a bench, or maybe if you're in your hotel room, up on your bed. And what they sought to investigate was, what's the distribution of the load, because we know that it's not entirely on the front leg, but what's the relative percentage of front to rear leg. And I found it was about 85% on the front leg, 15% on the rear leg. That's by a guy called Mark Helm I think he's in Leeds Beckett University or somewhere like that. So that was interesting. So you could do your rear foot elevated split squats. You could also, depending on what sort of bed you have, you might be able to slip your heels in underneath your bed frame and do Nordic hamstring curls.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so all of a sudden now you can get some more challenging exercises. Now the difficulty with the body weight stuff, and this was stuff that I had to prescribe for people during the first lockdown, particularly because gyms were closed, like that. So we had
equipment
to
was very expensive as well. Yeah. Equipment was going for like 3-4 times the price, even secondhand stuff. Even it was crazy. Like, it was ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah, so we try and find these workarounds. So you had to get kind of inventive with things. So to cut a long story short, very, very effective exercises for the upper body that you can do with just body weight. More difficult for the lower body, but it can be done. The problem with the bodyweight exercises is that is not about getting a hard workout or a series of hard workouts. It's about providing overload over time. That's kind of the difficulty there, because unless if, you have some way of adding weight onto yourself, like a weight vest or putting a plate on your back or that kind of thing, it's just more difficult to overload over time. But, for short term, like the example you gave where you're in a hotel for a night, very easy to get a very challenging workout from just bodyweight exercises.
Yeah. There's a guy called Steve Bingley. He was at the Australian Institute of Sport when we were there. He's in Canberra. He's probably about the same age as me, ex-military guy, Australian military. And he's got like a boot camp type business in Canberra that's got I think hundreds of people that goes to it, lots of outdoor stuff in the morning, might be called Century Strong or something like that. Anyway, I want to have Steve on the podcast because Steve, I think, believe in his master's project that he was doing at the IS at the same time was looking at the efficacy of and the benefits of the burpee. And, basically he was kind of looking at, because the burpee's done so much in the military and people hate the burpee. But it's kind of, if you had one exercise to pick, only one body weight, the burpee's probably the one that gives you the overall best value or bang for your buck. But, I think, again, people don't like it because it absolutely fucks them up. It's really difficult to do. But if you can do a burpee, it's a good sign, I think, or a good probably measure or indicative of people's, general strength, fitness, mobility, movement, a bit like, Turkish get-ups are the same as well. People often kind of say they're a good measurement of different things. So, yeah, it's quite interesting. Adding in these different things. So, Arthur, whether people are doing body weight stuff, whether they're doing HIIT sessions, whether they're doing machines, no matter what age they are, power lifters, teenagers starting to play rugby or doing a contact sport or just for general, interest. What would you say to people are the benefits of lifting weights or doing any of these activities? We'll just call them general strength and conditioning activities over their lifetime. What's the benefit of incorporating them in, whether it be once a week or 5 times a week? What's the long-term health benefits, and why should people, incorporate them or bear these in mind?
Yeah. So you can probably you can sort of subcategorize these into 2 themes, if you like. So performance and then overall health. Now, there's going to be a lot of overlap. So, for example, improving strength, depending on the individual, that could have a very profound effect on their overall health. But we'll just say, in general, performance and then overall health. So in terms of performance, you're talking about, like we've mentioned, increased strength, increased muscle hypertrophy, increased power production. And there's been many studies that have documented improved indicators of sports performance, just improved sprint speed, jump height, peak power during jumping, change of direction ability. And then another thing that's huge for the point of view of strength and conditioning is the potential for weight training or resistance exercise done in the right way to reduce someone's risk of injury. Now, it's not going to reduce the chances of, if someone gets a wallop in an MMA bout or gets hit in a rugby match, it's not going to reduce the likelihood of them getting hurt there. But what it does protect against is like non-contact based non-contact injuries, overuse injuries, that kind of thing. So done in the right way, it can reduce the likelihood of you picking up one of those injuries. Then in terms of overall health, I suppose the first one would be improved bone health through increased bone mineral density, increased bone strength, improved overall metabolic health by virtue of improving your body composition, improving your blood lipid profile. So lowers your LDL cholesterol, your bad cholesterol, if you like, and increases your HDL cholesterol or your good cholesterol, to completely oversimplify. But then you have improved insulin sensitivity and things like improved or reduced blood pressure in those who are hypertensive or pre-hypertensive. And that kind of covers most of them, really, you know.
So taking in like the caveats about age, previous injuries, not overloading too much, not going crazy, there really is no downside to incorporating strength and conditioning into your life once or twice a week.
Yeah, like anything, the difference between a medicine and a poison is the dose, you know. So
Yeah.
like in the example we gave earlier on, someone who goes in hell for leather, has completely unrealistic and lofty aspirations. They may actually do themselves more harm than good, but starting off with a minimally effective dose and then progressing that over time is a very effective strategy.
But speaking of medicine and lethal doses, Arthur, you remind me of a guy in a bar in Ireland about 21 years ago who came into the bar after having a heart attack. He was released from hospital, and he was sitting there drinking a few pints and telling war stories. He wasn't even that old, probably in his mid-40s. And he said, the doctor said I can only have 7 pints a day from now on. And I went, what? 7 pints? I was working behind the bar. 7 pints a day. The doctor said 7 pints. Yeah, 7 pints a day. I said, I think maybe he said 7 pints a week, like one a day, like you need to cut down. No, 7 pints a day. So the doctor prescribed to you to have basically 50 pints in a week. I said, that's like half a barrel of Guinness a week. Yep, that's what he said. I said, I'd like to go and see your doctor. So I think I think he heard what he wanted to hear and he was doing what he wanted to do. So 1 pint a day is not too bad, but yeah, he was 1 pint a day might be good for your iron levels or have a bit of social interaction, but 7 pints a day, it's a fair bit of liquid to be consuming, never mind alcohol.
What did you find out whatever became of him? Like,
no, no, I didn't. No, but as you know yourself, like in Ireland, there's plenty of barflies around that just talk shite.
yeah,
Yeah, you know what I love about now. Well, maybe I wouldn't. Maybe it wouldn't be so good, but back then people didn't have the internet on their phones. Mobile phones were just coming out in the late 90s, so you couldn't really fact check people straight away. Now you can fact check people, but I think that takes away half the fun of listening to the lies and the stories. Like I've been a long time gone out of Ireland, so I wonder do people go, put away your stupid phone? What would that know? I'm telling you now, the doctor said 7 pints a day, so I'm not sure what would be said.
yeah.
Yeah, I know a few of those type of characters though have since departed the world, because we're drinking, way too much. But anyway, Arthur, to wrap up, to give you some credibility for all you've been saying here, can you you said at the start you did your PhD and it kind of took a few twists and turns, ended up becoming more biomechanics. What did you set out to do, or what was your initial kind of query or hypothesis that you had in the PhD thesis?
How long have you got?
We have about 7 minutes.
Okay. Right. Well, so I think to be fair, when I I decided I wanted to do a PhD when I was about halfway through my degree, and then I met a potential supervisor and explained to him, look, I'd like to do a PhD. Have you any projects that you're looking at doing down the line? And he had one, and it was meant to be in basically looking at potentially improving health outcomes in sort of, I suppose, office workers by breaking up their sitting time by introducing these like 5-minute exercise snacks, if you like, where they would leave their desk, maybe walk around the building, go back in and
have 7 pints.
and 7 pints, yeah. No, go back to work. And because there's a lot of research suggesting that prolonged sitting is quite deleterious to your health. And what we were sort of looking at is sort of, again, this idea of the minimum effective dose of breaking up that sitting time for improving some markers of overall health. And that was kind of an interesting and exciting project. Long story short, when we applied for the funding for the PhD, we didn't get it. So we sort of went our separate ways. A year later, I came back. So at this point, I'm out of my degree about a year, and I met with a different supervisor. And this lad has a bit of a reputation. Let's just put it that way. And he he made shit of me in the interview process or whatever. But the co-supervisor, the potential co-supervisor who was there that day, met with me afterwards and said, "Look, don't take it personally. That's just the way he is. We actually think you're a fantastic candidate. We'd like to pursue this with you." So I ended up pursuing it with him, and the project was meant to be looking at fish oil supplementation and adaptations to resistance exercise. And we were kind of hanging our hats on one study from about 2011, I think it was, where they fed elderly subjects with, so they supplemented them with fish oils, and then gave them an acute dose of protein. And what they found was that when you had pre-supplemented them with the fish oils, they actually had an improved anabolic response to the protein feeding. It was hypothesized that some of that was around reducing chronic inflammation and reducing the anabolic resistance that tends to accompany getting older. But the difficulty we had was like we're looking at a younger population and more of a performance-based cohort, if you like. So a lot of that kind of stuff doesn't really apply to them. So about a year in, there was one study that looked at what we were planning to investigate acutely and found nothing. So we were like, okay, guys, we really don't have a lot to be. We don't have enough to be kind of pursuing this. I think this is dead in the water. So at that point, my supervisor said to me, right, well, if not fish oils, then what else? And this was in a Ph.D. meeting. So I was there trying to think, what could we use? And I remember prior to that reading a study on HMB, beta hydroxy, beta methyl butyrate, which is a metabolite of leucine, which is one of the essential amino acids, and it's considered the trigger for muscle protein synthesis. So I kind of said that without really thinking too much. And he sort of said, now you might be onto something. But I was never really fully convinced of it. And HMB has a bit of a tainted reputation because of a couple of studies in 2013 and 2014 that were published and found some very eyebrow-raising results, like steroid-like effects. And
Really?
there was a couple of letters to the editor. There was one published with basically all the heavy hitters in the field, basically saying, "Lads, I'm really not sure about this. This flies in the face of everything that has been published before and since. We just don't think that these kind of results are possible with HMB." And everything that has been published since then is suggesting, they're probably right. So HMB has this kind of tainted reputation. So I didn't really feel comfortable even pursuing it. But I had sort of accepted, right, this is probably what I'm going to be looking at. Long story short, between difficulties with the relationship with my supervisor and then just me not overly believing in the project, the whole thing sort of broke down, and eventually I split from what was my main supervisor. And at that point, my then co-supervisor became my main supervisor. Now, whilst all this was going on, I had decided, because I was like, okay, I got to do something. I'm going crazy here. I've got to start collecting some data. Another PhD student at the time who was doing his own research on recovery of muscle function following resistance exercise was planning to use an isometric squat test as his measure of muscle function. But at the time, he had no reliability data on the measure, so he didn't know how reliable it was day to day. And of course, if your measure isn't reliable, it's more difficult to detect real change by virtue of your intervention. So I said to him, right, I'll do that reliability study for you, no problem. And that reliability study ended up being my first PhD study. And then once the relationship with my former main supervisor broke down, I kind of said, right, do I want to do the HMB stuff, or I could specialize in this isometric squat stuff? And eventually that's what I did. So I did a few more studies. I did another reliability study in a different population. So the first one was looking at the reliability of the measure across different angles. And the second one was looking at the reliability across what we term the strength spectrum. And some might interpret that as like an absolute speed to absolute strength spectrum, which isn't what it was. What we meant by that was from untrained individuals who have never lifted weights before to moderately trained individuals who, lift weights a few times a week. They're familiar with squatting exercise, that kind of thing, all the way up to very highly trained subjects, competitive powerlifters with a minimum back squat 1RM of twice their body weight. And what we found was that across that spectrum, the reliability was no different. So that was interesting because, for example, if you were to use 1RM, that would be completely inappropriate to use with the untrained individuals, So, I mean, imagine, you've never lifted weights before and I bring you into a lab and say, I want to test your 1RM back squat. That wouldn't be appropriate to do. But we could do that with the isometric, So it's the same, similar biomechanics, but it's a static movement. So it's much safer.
Yeah. So there's no actual, I've seen it before, but I've seen tests on it and been involved in it. But for people who may not be aware, it actually has no weight on it.
No, exactly. So imagine a squat rack that's mounted around two force plates and it's bolted to the floor, and then there's a bar that is positioned within the rack and fixed in a position. Now you can adjust the height, but once you place it into the holes in the rack, it's fixed in that position. You get in underneath the bar and you assume a squatting posture, if you like, and then Newton's third law, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So by you pushing into the bar, the force that you're producing is read. So, well, it's basically by you pushing into the force plates underneath you, but that comes from you contracting and trying to push the bar up. If that makes sense.
Commonly known as pulling and dragging.
Basically, yeah. So we're measuring the peak force output from there. So anyway, that was the second reliability study done. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but anyway, I'll keep going.
30 seconds. No, I'm just joking. Keep going. Yeah.
So the third study then, what we wanted to know is related to what I was mentioning earlier on about reliability is, so the next thing is how sensitive is the measure, or how responsive is it to a training stimulus? So we took moderately trained individuals, tested their 1 rep max squat and their peak isometric force on the isometric squat, gave them a 6-week training program, and then retested those two outcome measures. What we found was that the measure was sensitive, but there was far more variability compared to the 1RM. And I would chalk that up to specificity, because they would have been performing back squats as part of the training routine. So they'd have been more familiar with that movement compared to the isometric squat, where they would have only done pre and post training. And then my final study, which was the data from it was a lot more murky, but the concept I found interesting was, so in the first two studies, I noted that, so I mentioned that there were two force plates underneath the individuals when they're squatting. So that's interesting because you can look at what's termed interlimb asymmetries. So we can look at, is there any noticeable difference in the peak force on the left side versus the right side, or the stronger versus the left side? And what I noted, or what I observed in the first couple of studies, was that there are actually quite a few individuals with a marked asymmetry between limbs, so sometimes greater than 10%. So I said, right, that's interesting. And then I dug into a bit of the literature and said, right, well, is there any evidence to suggest that if we have someone, now this is in people who are uninjured, and if you have an injury, that complicates things further, because you may have an inherent asymmetry due to the injury. But in non-injured individuals who present with this marked asymmetry, basically, can we train it out of them? So if we train them in a particular way, can we reduce some of this interlimb asymmetry? And there was one study that found pretty good results, or pretty promising results using back squats, whereby in individuals who are kind of weak, if we get them stronger, they actually become more symmetrical as a result. So I was like, all right, well, that study is out there. Is there anything on unilateral exercises? So like our rear foot elevated split squat or single leg RDL. And part of the reason I was interested in that is because it's this thing that gets thrown around anecdotally. It's like, oh, I'm doing these unilateral exercises to work on all my imbalances. And if you've ever tried those exercises for the first time, you might find that you're very stable and coordinated on one side, and then on the other side, you're falling all over the place.
Like you had 7 pints.
Exactly. So I said, right, well, what would happen if we use those exercises from the point of view of performance? Because ultimately, if this asymmetry thing, so for example, if we improve asymmetry, but there's no change in performance, it's not really, to me, it's not worth worrying about, you know?
Yeah.
So if we find that we can improve performance and reduce this asymmetry, well, then we're on to a winner. So that's basically what I did for my last study. Was I gave 2 groups. So one that's training with bilateral exercises, so your squats, your deadlifts, and the other group, your unilateral exercises, your rear foot elevated split squat and your single leg RDL for 6 weeks. And we kept the outcome measures the same as the last study. So we still had the 1RM back squat. We still had the isometric squat. And then we tested those pre and post both of those 2 interventions. 6 weeks of training in both of them. What we found was that, interestingly, the performance was improved in the 1RM in both groups. The bilateral training improved isometric squat strength, and in the unilateral group, there was a trend towards improving isometric squat strength. And the reason I say that is because COVID-19 sort of messed us up a little bit, because we lost about 7 subjects at that point. So that's why I say there's a trend towards it, because that's.
So what was your p-value there then, Arthur?
It was
0.06.
0.08 actually, yeah.
Oh yeah.
I
thought it had to be 6 to say a trend, but anyway, there you go.
I reckon if we got the other 7 subjects to the end of to the completion of the training, because a couple of them were doing really well in their training, I reckon we would have got a significant effect. But anyway, we still saw it in the 1RM. Then with the asymmetry stuff, it was a bit murky, a little bit more messy, because that stuff is there's just some variability that's very difficult to explain there. So let me illustrate what I mean for you. So what we noticed was that if you just looked at the whole group, there was basically no change in asymmetry, because some guys were getting worse, some guys were getting better, and all in all, it was sort of balancing each other out, and the mean effect was in around 0. However, if you just look at the subjects who I termed had what we termed a meaningful asymmetry, so 10% or greater difference between limbs, you saw a much more reliable trend towards a reduction in asymmetry. So in those who had a marked asymmetry at baseline, they were more likely to improve it and get under this sort of 10% threshold. And the reason I used 10% was because the CV of the test itself was about 8%. And there's some literature as well that's been trying to establish sort of thresholds of like, right, what's any asymmetry that's worth worrying about? 10 to 15 is kind of what a lot of them come up with. Now there's issues with that, and there's some pretty good critiques you could give of a lot of that. But broadly speaking, somewhere around that is what you might consider a genuine asymmetry. So then, yeah, the reduction in asymmetry was a bit more reliable as well in the bilateral training group compared to the unilateral training group. But again, if we'd got all the subjects in the unilateral training group, because they did their they were finishing after the bilateral group. If we'd got all of those subjects to completion, the results might have been slightly different.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point there you bring up about COVID. I have a couple of PhD students I'm working with. Like one obviously couldn't collect data during that period. One other lady had to stop data collection, and she's now finding it really difficult to get it going again because it's very clinical, looking at IBS and sleep and mood and mental health. And then another lady was poxed. So lucky she got all her data about 4 days before the lockdown here in Western Australia, which was just absolute pure gold. She got all her data, all devices back, looking at shift workers in remote mining populations, and a big study, and she got it back. So I think I feel for people like yourself, Arthur, or other people are just starting a PhD now, trying to collect data during this period, because some people have taken 3-4 years off even work to do this, or put their careers on hold, or they're doing it part-time, and then this happens and gets drawn out, and it's an absolute pain in the ass. Obviously it's first world problems, but it's it can be quite difficult and frustrating for a lot of people. So the other good thing I like about your story there, Arthur, independent of the findings, is that is a wild and wonderful PhD journey. I think a lot of people think that you do a PhD and you go to a lab every day and you wear a coat and you do some little things and you do a little project and then you become a PhD. What you've described there is the difficulty that is amongst many people in trying to get what I would call applied PhDs. So when you're trying to collect data in people, is extremely difficult, not working in a lab, not to disparage that type of work, but you've just really highlighted and shown there in your journey how difficult it can be to get a PhD and how difficult it can be to collect data in people, and then have a hypothesis, not getting kind of good preliminary findings, have to change tact, and then at the very end of it you get slapped with COVID as well. So you earned that doctor title, so you should definitely get Danny Lennon to call you doctor from now on, seeing as he was so smart on Instagram, with some of his comments. So you definitely deserve more than I do to get called doctor now after that journey. That was crazy, man. So hats off to you for overcoming all of those obstacles of people, project management, conflicting personalities, changing tact, finding a way through it, which I think is all the good things that you learn out of a PhD in conjunction with becoming an expert in your area. But these are all the additional benefits you get from doing a PhD. So congratulations, Arthur. That was a good journey for you.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll say a few words in defense of Danny. I mean, anyone who knows me knows that I don't really take myself too seriously. So when I saw that post, I was skitting laughing, I have to say.
Oh, look, I was laughing at it too, because I obviously don't know Danny as well as you, but Danny was here in Australia a couple of years ago. I think it was maybe 2 years ago, year and a half ago, and myself and Danny went out for lunch, and I brought him to like a sushi tray place, and I was like, "Oh, sorry, Danny, I know you're paleo, but," and he just looked at me, So he has got a good sense of humor. But I tell you what is really disturbing about Danny is those pictures that he posts in a singlet. He needs to stop doing that. I've told him that numerous times. He needs to wear a shirt.
Well, funnily enough, it's funny you should say that, because the IPF, the federation that we compete in, they passed a rule at the last General Assembly that they had, whereby so what it originally stemmed from was because male lifters were allowed to take off their t-shirts for deadlifts, but female lifters weren't.
Okay.
So there was complaints from females as to like, well, why can't we take off our t-shirts? And eventually the IPF just sort of said, it was kind of those like, right, well, you kids don't know how to play fair, so we're just going to take all the toys away from you, and made a rule that all male competitors must now wear t-shirts as well. So
there you go. And if you're wondering why people want to take off their shirts, you clearly haven't deadlifted people. So go out there and deadlift, and you'll learn why. Arthur, thanks very much for your time today. If people want to get a hold of you, want to follow your work, see any of your work coming out of your PhD, how can people get in contact with you? How can they follow you?
Yeah, so probably the best place to follow me, I actually host a podcast myself, and you've been one of my most treasured guests, Ian. And the podcast is called the No Lift Podcast, and I'm kind of going all in on that right now in terms of where I want people to to go to follow me. So if you search No Lift Podcast on Instagram, all one word, that's the best place to find me, and that's where I'd prefer you'd follow me, because I'm trying to push promotion towards there. I have a personal page, but I just don't care about it anymore.
No, that's great. The No Lift Podcast.
Yeah, that'd be the best place to find me. And if you just direct message me there, if you want to find out more about myself, you can email me as well. But that'd be as handy.
No Lift Podcast, great. So what's the future hold for you, Arthur, now that the PhD is done? You're building this No Lift Podcast. What do you see the next couple of years being?
Well, finish up the corrections for my thesis will be the first thing. And once that's done and signed off on, and I have my hands washed of the PhD completely, because that's maybe something that not everyone's aware of. Once you finish your oral examination, your viva, you still have corrections to make.
Yeah.
Or at least most people do. Once that's done, then who knows? It's a strange time, because academia isn't a lot of fun right now. There's a lot of people having to work from home and doing lectures over Zoom and stuff like that, and it's not as fun as it can be. But like I probably will go into academia and we'll see. I'm a bit hesitant, because the honest answer is I'm not entirely sure, but that's where I'm likely to end up, I'd say.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'd say to you is look at different ways of doing it. Like for me, for example, I run a consultancy business. I make my living out of doing that. Obviously, that's a bit more challenging, but it gives me the freedom then to work on academic projects whenever I want. So I'm not a full-time academic. I just have adjunct positions, which are honorary positions. So I still get to dabble in research, but try to do the research that's going to help me grow as a person, but also help my business as well, kind of cross-pollinate as well. So I think that may be the way of the future of some people. I think getting full-time academic roles are getting harder and harder, more difficult, and funding is kind of probably reducing. And then I don't know if this is the same case in Ireland or other countries, but funding seems to be reducing, but more PhDs are getting produced as well, which, is kind of oversupply, which is great that we're educating, our nations, and people are getting kind of better at doing it. Some people might say the standard has dropped to PhDs. I don't know. But anyway, there's probably an oversupply, compared to maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago. But I think, there's obviously different ways of doing it. And not every PhD has to be an academic. So, there's practical ways of applying a PhD learning as well. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting. But I can see it in the Arthur anyway. No matter, I think, a bit like myself, I think no matter what you do, you'll have your finger stuck in some research project somewhere, because I can see your eyes light up when you talk about it. So I think you'll always have some finger in something going on, even if you are working for yourself or working for somebody else. I think you'll always be involved.
Well, that's the hope as well. And like, to your point, I think as well, with regards to funding, like a lot of people that I speak to in academia, like they're getting funding, but it's for projects that maybe they're not entirely invested in. In, but it's like, this is really what does it for me. But it's because that's where the funding is. They have to go for it.
Yeah. And as a side note, before we wrap up, a lot of people kind of think that you get a PhD and automatically you're offered a job at university as a lecturer and a researcher, or one or the other, and then that the government just gives you money and over again all year, and you're kind of funded by the taxpayers to just do whatever you want, which is it's so far away from the truth. Like, it's unbelievable, where it's like you got to apply for funding. If you don't get a certain amount of funding, you might actually lose your job. You're nearly like, if you're working in a lab or leading a lab, you're like a small business unit. You got to kind of win work as a project. You got to bring that money in. You got to pay for the staff. You got to. It's quite difficult being an academic. Money's not easy to get, and like you said, and you have to kind of take on some projects you may not be that interested in, but it gives you, the funding to get something going, and you can spin off some other projects and maybe get some findings to then use those findings to apply for other funding in different areas. It's a bit like what we had a panel discussion at World Sleep last year in Vancouver, and we all got up speaking about sleep and athletic performance, and somebody got up and was kind of like, well, you need to look at, leptin and ghrelin levels in athletes like we do in shift workers with sleep loss, and this may be causing obesity and blah, blah, blah. And the panel was kind of like, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, if we get funding. And the person asking the question in the audience goes, well, just apply for the funding. And we went, there's actually no funding sources for sleep and performance in elite athletes. And the person asked the question went, what? Well, how do you do this work? And we all just started giggling and went, and one of the guys, I won't say who he was, went, like, he actually said this in the room, like, this is fucked, he goes, this is what we have to do. We just have to scrimp from different budgets, different funding to do this. He goes, most of us here are putting in our own time and our own interest. We might work with Olympic groups or committees, but they're not funding us to do this. It's very little. If we even get our costs covered, we're happy. And that's definitely true. There's not this endless pot of money to be used for research. So, it's quite interesting. Probably warrants a podcast on its own with a group of academics telling war stories about it, because I think a lot of people are naive to how that part of the world works.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that turned me off doing that. Like, I think academia should be this utopia where you should work and you should get money and do whatever you want. It will be great, but it's one of the things that turned me off. I was like, at my age and where I'm in my life, I didn't want to go looking for money there. I'd rather get money from business and chart my own destiny. So. Yeah,
and another thing, like, I'm sorry to hold you, but just the last point that I think is important is that, like, for me, observing, like my supervisor and other academics in the university where I work, like, doing all that stuff is a full-time job in and of itself.
Yeah.
Not only that, but they have to conduct the research and also be full-time teachers.
It's not easy. There's no sitting around on the grass like smoking marijuana talking about a social upheaval. That doesn't happen, only in the movies.
Like, the worst part about it is it doesn't leave much time for getting your 7 pints a day in.
Well, you know what, Arthur? We'll end on that now. Get your 7 pints in, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you all had a good Christmas. It's time to get out there, lift some weights, whether it's high intensity training, whether it's body weight. Just get out there and do something every week. Maybe have your 7 pints after that. How about that, Arthur?
That sounds perfectly reasonable.
There you go. Yeah, and then you can tell people that 2 doctors told you in the podcast. Arthur, thanks very much for your time today. I really appreciate you coming on. Really had I really enjoyed that chat. It was really interesting. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much for having me on, and I thoroughly enjoyed it as well.
Cheers, man. Thanks.
We could drive along an ocean reflecting the sun, or make a bed of green atop a wide open scene. Under a canvas of blue, I would draw ever nearer to you, to feel the dew on your skin. That is how it would begin. For summer is for falling in love. We could stay out late until the sun sets past 8, and the cotton candy haze mirrors the warmth of your gaze. Raise your glass to mine, and as we drink, we would lock eyes, so we could disregard the thought of ever having to part. For summer is for falling in love. Lightness of being, we both know to be fleeting, like the last breath of a sunset right before the day is dead. But maybe the heat of today could keep even winter away, so I'll remember 'cause nothing ever changes the fact that summer is for falling in love. Da-dun-da-dun-day. Summer is for falling